A dog waited at her wedding for hours. What it revealed about her past will break your heart. It was the perfect day for a wedding, or at least it seemed so to everyone watching. The golden rays of a late spring sun bathed the secluded garden in warmth. Rows of chairs lined the manicured lawn, filled with guests in their finest attire. Flowers of every pastel hue adorned the white trellis, and the faint hum of a cello completed the idyllic scene. The bride, radiant in her flowing lace gown, appeared calm, though a palpable sense of anticipation lingered in the air. But amidst the sea of expectant faces, there was an unexpected guest, one who did not sit in a chair or blend into the festive atmosphere. At the edge of the garden, near a grove of tall oaks, stood a dog. Its fur was a patchwork of brown and white, weathered with age and time. It wasn't wearing a collar, and though it looked well fed, there was a ruggedness about it, like it belonged somewhere far from the pristine world of wedding ceremonies. The dog wasn't moving. It just stood there, motionless, watching. Occasionally its head would tilt slightly, its eyes shifting from the bride to the aisle where she was to walk. It looked expectant, as though it were waiting for something or someone. Some of the guests noticed and chuckled, nudging one another. "Looks like someone's dog crashed the wedding," whispered an older woman in a lilac hat. But the dog didn't act like a crasher. There was no aimless sniffing or wandering. It stayed rooted to its spot, focused entirely on the bride. Even the whispers and soft laughter couldn't distract it. When the ceremony began and the music swelled, the dog's ears perked up. As the bride walked down the aisle, escorted by her father, the dog took a few hesitant steps forward, its eyes locked onto her. It stopped short of the aisle, but it didn't look away. A flicker of recognition seemed to pass through its expression, almost human in its intensity. The bride, Emma, caught sight of the dog as she approached the altar. For a fleeting moment, her serene mask cracked. Her steps faltered ever so slightly, and her hand tightened on her father's arm. The guests noticed, too, and exchanged curious glances. The groom, James, standing at the altar, tilted his head in confusion. But Emma recovered quickly, her smile returning as if nothing had happened. The ceremony continued without a hitch, at least to the untrained eye. Vows were exchanged, rings slipped onto trembling fingers, and applause filled the garden. But the dog remained at the edge, unmoving, a silent observer to a day that should have been perfect. It was during the reception that the questions began. The dog had not left. It now sat just beyond the tables, its gaze still fixed on Emma, who was doing her best to mingle and accept congratulations. Every so often she'd glance toward the animal, her composed exterior cracking under the weight of some unspoken emotion. "Whose dog is that?" James asked, his tone light but curious, as they stood together for a moment between dances. "Does it belong to someone we know?" Emma hesitated. For a moment she seemed like she might brush off the question, but then she shook her head. "No," she said quietly. "It doesn't belong to anyone here." James frowned, sensing something in her tone. "Are you sure? It's been watching you all day. It's almost eerie." Emma gave a tight smile, but her eyes betrayed her. "I'm sure," she said, and then she excused herself, claiming she needed a moment to freshen up. She didn't go to the restroom, though. Instead, she slipped out of sight of the guests and made her way to the edge of the garden, where the dog still sat. Up close, its fur looked even rougher, its eyes clouded but intelligent. It didn't move as she approached, didn't flinch when she knelt in front of it, her pristine gown brushing against the earth. "What are you doing here?" Emma whispered, her voice breaking. "How did you find me?" The dog tilted its head, its gaze unwavering. For a long moment, it felt as though it might speak, as though it might answer the questions that hung between them, like a heavy fog. But of course, it didn't. Emma reached out a trembling hand, hesitating before letting it rest gently on the dog's head. Its fur was coarse but warm, and the contact seemed to undo something in her. Tears welled in her eyes and spilled over, and before she knew it, she was sobbing quietly, her shoulders shaking. The dog didn't move away. It stayed perfectly still, its presence steady and grounding. Emma felt the weight of years pressing down on her chest, memories she had locked away now flooding back with a vengeance. This wasn't just a stray dog. It couldn't be. It was her dog, or at least it had been. "Sammy," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. The name hung in the air, a whisper of the past that refused to be silenced. When Emma finally returned to the reception, her eyes were red, though she tried to mask it with a forced smile. The dog didn't follow her this time, but it didn't leave either. It sat there, a ghost from her past, refusing to be ignored. As the evening wore on and the festivities began to wind down, guests noticed Emma's distraction. She laughed in the right places and danced when prompted, but her heart wasn't in it. Her gaze kept drifting toward the dog, and a sense of unease settled over the celebration. By the time the last guests were saying their goodbyes, the dog had moved closer. It now sat just outside the glow of the string lights, its presence a quiet but undeniable reminder of something unresolved. James approached Emma as she stood near the edge of the garden, staring at the dog. "Emma," he said gently, touching her arm, "what's going on? Do you know that dog?" She opened her mouth to deny it, but the lie caught in her throat. She turned to him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I do," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I know him." James frowned, his confusion deepening. "How? Where is he from?" Emma's voice trembled as she replied, "He's from a long time ago, before I met you, before everything changed." James didn't press her further, sensing that this was not the moment for questions, but the look in Emma's eyes haunted him. Whatever connection she had to the dog, it was tied to something deep, something painful. And as they stood there, the weight of that unspoken story hung heavy in the air. The dog didn't leave that night. It curled up at the edge of the garden, its eyes still watching Emma as she and James retreated to the house. And though Emma tried to put it out of her mind, she couldn't shake the feeling that Sammy's presence wasn't a coincidence. It was a message, a reminder of a past she thought she had buried. The next morning, the world felt different. The air was heavy, carrying the weight of something unseen but deeply felt. The garden, now empty of guests and stripped of its festive charm, seemed almost solemn under the muted light of a cloudy sky. Emma awoke to find Sammy lying on the porch steps, his head resting on his paws. His presence was as unwavering as it had been the day before. He wasn't just lingering, he was waiting. James noticed the dog too. As he sipped his coffee by the window, he watched the animal with a mix of curiosity and concern. "Emma," he called, his tone gentle. "He's still here." Emma froze mid-step, her hand gripping the railing of the staircase. She knew exactly who James meant. For a moment she considered pretending she hadn't heard him, but the truth was relentless, gnawing at the edges of her composure. She couldn't ignore it any longer. "I'll handle it," she said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Steeling herself, she walked out to the porch. Sammy lifted his head as she approached, his tail thumping softly against the wooden planks. Despite the years that had passed, there was something achingly familiar in his movements, a flicker of the bond they had once shared. Emma crouched down, her voice trembling. "Why are you here, Sammy?" she whispered, her fingers brushing over his fur. "After all this time, why now?" The dog leaned into her touch, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding that pierced straight through her. Emma felt tears welling up again, but she blinked them away. She couldn't afford to fall apart, not yet. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice cracking as she spoke to the dog, as if he could truly understand her. "But not here, not now." Later that day, James found her sitting on the edge of the bed, her wedding dress still draped over a chair in the corner. She was holding a faded photograph, the edges worn and frayed. It was a picture of a younger Emma, no older than 20, with an unmistakable glow in her smile. Beside her in the photograph was a man, a broad-shouldered, laughing figure, and at their feet sat Sammy, his tail caught mid-wag. James hesitated in the doorway. "Who's that?" he asked softly, nodding toward the photo. Emma looked up, startled. For a moment, she seemed torn between hiding the picture and letting him see it. Finally, she sighed and handed it to him. "That's Liam," she said, her voice barely audible. "And that's the old me." James studied the photo, his brow furrowing. "Liam," he repeated, testing the name. "Was he—" Emma nodded, swallowing hard. He was my first love, my everything. James sat down beside her, his expression a mix of understanding and hurt. You've never mentioned him. I couldn't, Emma admitted, her voice breaking. It was too much. Even now it feels like ripping open a wound that never fully healed. She reached for the photo, tracing her finger over the image of Sammy. Sammy was ours. Liam and I rescued him together when he was just a pup. He was always by our side, through everything. James didn't interrupt, sensing that Emma needed to let the words spill out. And spill they did, in a torrent of memories and pain. We were young and reckless, Emma continued, her eyes distant as she spoke. Liam had this way of making everything feel alive. He was always dreaming, always planning the next big adventure. And I was right there with him, ready to take on the world. Her voice wavered, and she took a shaky breath before continuing. But life has a way of tearing down dreams, doesn't it? Liam got sick, cancer. It was aggressive, relentless. We fought it together, but there was only so much we could do. Tears streamed down her face now, and James placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. She didn't seem to notice. Sammy was there through all of it, Emma said, her voice cracking. When Liam was too weak to get out of bed, Sammy would curl up beside him, refusing to leave his side. He was more than a dog. He was family. She paused, her breath hitching as she fought to keep speaking. Liam made me promise something before he passed. He made me swear I'd move on, that I'd find happiness again. But I couldn't. Not for a long time. Emma looked up at James then, her eyes pleading for understanding. When I finally met you, it felt like I was starting to heal. I thought I could leave all of that behind, lock it away like it never happened. But seeing Sammy again, it's like the past is demanding to be acknowledged. James nodded slowly, his hand tightening on hers. And maybe it's time to face it. That evening, Emma sat with Sammy in the garden, the cool breeze rustling through the trees. She held the photograph in her lap, her fingers tracing its edges. You were supposed to move on too, she murmured, her voice soft but firm. Liam's gone, Sammy. He's been gone for years. What are you doing here? Sammy leaned his head against her knee, his eyes closing as if he were reliving his own memories. Emma felt a pang of guilt. Had she been the one who had abandoned him, leaving him to grieve alone? Did you stay there waiting for me? She asked, her voice trembling. At the house? At the places we used to go? She thought about the old house she had shared with Liam, the place they had built their dreams together. It had been sold years ago, and she had never returned. But Sammy, maybe he had stayed, holding on to the fragments of their old life. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. Sammy wasn't just here for her, he was here for Liam too, and somehow he had found her. Emma wiped her tears, determination hardening her expression. You deserve answers too, she said, stroking his fur. We both do. The next morning, Emma made a decision. She packed a bag, filled a small cooler with supplies, and leashed Sammy for the first time in years. When James asked where she was going, she simply said, I need to revisit where it all began. I need to take Sammy home. And as they drove away, Emma couldn't help but feel that this journey was more than just a goodbye. It was a chance to finally confront the pieces of herself she had been running from for so long. The road stretched out before Emma like a thread pulling her back to a life she had tried so hard to leave behind. The familiar hum of the car engine filled the silence. But her mind was far from quiet. Each mile seemed to strip away the layers of emotional armor she had built over the years, leaving her raw and exposed. Sammy sat in the passenger seat, his head resting on the edge of the window, watching the world blur past. He seemed calm, as if he understood exactly where they were going and why. Emma glanced at him occasionally, marveling at how little he seemed to have changed. The gray in his fur, the slight stiffness in his movements, those were just the marks of time. But his essence, his spirit, was the same as it had been all those years ago. The landscape shifted as they drove further into the countryside. The city's sharp edges gave way to rolling fields and dense woods, their colors muted under a blanket of clouds. Emma's hands tightened on the steering wheel as the scenery became increasingly familiar. The old farmhouse where she had lived with Liam wasn't far now. Her heart raced as she turned onto the narrow gravel road leading to the house. It felt surreal, like stepping into a dream she hadn't visited in years. The farmhouse came into view, its white paint peeling and its shutters hanging slightly askew. It was clear that time had taken its toll, but the bones of the place were still strong. It was still home, in its own way. Emma parked the car and sat for a moment, staring at the house. Memories came rushing back. Liam laughing as he painted the shutters a bright blue, Sammy chasing butterflies in the tall grass, the two of them dancing barefoot on the porch under a blanket of stars. The weight of it all threatened to crush her. Sammy barked softly, snapping her out of her reverie. She glanced at him and managed a weak smile. "All right, boy," she said, her voice shaking. "Let's do this." She opened the door and Sammy leaped out with surprising agility for his age. He bounded toward the house as if no time had passed, his tail wagging furiously. Emma followed him, her steps hesitant and uneven. The front door was unlocked, creaking slightly as she pushed it open. The air inside was thick with the scent of wood and dust, and the floorboards groaned under her weight. The furniture was gone, the walls bare, but the essence of the home remained. It was in the way the light streamed through the windows, the way the wind whispered through the cracks in the walls. Sammy wandered through the house, his nose twitching as he sniffed every corner. Emma watched him, her chest tightening. He stopped in the living room, where a patch of sunlight pooled on the floor. He lay down there, resting his head on his paws, as if he were waiting for something, or someone. Emma knelt beside him, her fingers running through his fur. "This is where it all began," she said softly, "and where it ended." She closed her eyes, letting the memories wash over her. She could see Liam sitting on the couch, his sketchbook balanced on his knees, a pencil tucked behind his ear. She could hear his voice, warm and teasing, calling Sammy to come snuggle. She could feel the weight of his arm around her shoulders, the way he would press a kiss to her temple and whisper that everything would be okay. But everything hadn't been okay. Liam had slipped away, leaving a void so vast that Emma hadn't known how to fill it. She had tried to move forward, to build a new life, but a part of her had always remained tethered to this place, to him. And now, here was Sammy, tethered too. As the afternoon wore on, Emma began to explore the house, her steps growing steadier with each room she entered. In the bedroom, she found a small wooden box tucked away in the closet. She opened it with trembling hands and found a collection of photographs, letters, and trinkets, pieces of a life that felt both distant and immediate. One letter caught her eye. It was addressed to her, in Liam's handwriting. Her breath hitched as she unfolded the paper, the words blurring through her tears. "My dearest Emma, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer there to tell you how much I love you. But I need you to hear it anyway. I love you more than words could ever express. You were my light in the darkest of days, my reason to keep fighting, even when it felt impossible. I know you'll blame yourself when I'm gone. You'll think you could have done more, could have saved me somehow. But please don't carry that burden. You did everything you could. You gave me joy, even in the hardest moments. You gave me hope. And Emma, I need you to promise me something. Promise me that you'll keep living, that you'll find love again, laughter, adventure. Sammy will help you with that. He's a stubborn old soul, and he'll stick around to make sure you're okay. Don't let grief anchor you. Let it be a part of you, but not all of you. Remember me, but don't let my absence define you. With all my love, Liam." Emma clutched the letter to her chest, her sobs breaking the silence of the empty house. Sammy pressed against her side, his warmth a small comfort against the tidal wave of emotion. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I'm so sorry, Liam. I've been running for so long." She sat there for what felt like hours, the letter in her hands, Sammy by her side. When she finally stood, she felt lighter, as if Liam's words had lifted some of the weight she had been carrying. She walked outside where the sun was beginning to set, casting the fields in a golden glow. Sammy followed her, his tail wagging gently. They stood together on the porch, watching as the world bathed in the soft light of evening. For the first time in years, Emma felt a sense of peace. She had come full circle, revisiting the past she had tried so hard to forget. And in doing so, she had found something she hadn't expected: closure and a way forward. As she looked down at Sammy, she realized he had done the same. He had waited for her through all the years because he had known something she hadn't, that they needed to heal together. "Thank you," she whispered, stroking his fur, "for staying, for waiting." Sammy's tail wagged a little faster, his eyes shining with the same loyalty that had brought him back to her. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emma knew that this was only the beginning of their next chapter. Together.